I never thought I would cross paths with him again. Not in a place like this. The Wilshire Grand Hotel gleamed brightly under the night lights. The rooftop was transformed into a breathtaking scene with candles, silk-draped tables, and a piano playing softly, filling the air with music that blended perfectly with the sparkling Los Angeles skyline. The annual Monteverde Education Foundation Gala was the event of the season, a gathering of entrepreneurs, artists, and influential figures. But I wasn't there for the glamour. I had my own reasons for attending, and I wasn't alone. As I entered the venue, I walked alongside 4 young individuals, each tall, poised, and unique in their own way, yet they moved as one. We drew attention immediately, not just because of how we looked, but because of the energy that radiated from us. I could feel the eyes of the crowd on us, but one gaze in particular cut through the noise and made my heart stop for a moment. I turned, and there he was, Gabriel Whitmore. He stood among the guests, looking every bit the part in a sharp tuxedo, his salt and pepper hair neatly swept back, his eyes as piercing and intense as they were back then. But something was different in his gaze. It wasn't just recognition or surprise, it was confusion. He looked at me, then at the young faces next to me, and I could see the panic begin to rise in his eyes. His eyes flickered from one to the other, from Tyler's pale gray eyes to Elena's high cheekbones, then to Lucas's strong jaw and Isla's crooked half-smile. It was impossible to deny. These 4 young people held a part of him in each of them. I felt Isla's hand in mine. She turned to me, lips pressed tightly, her question clear in her eyes. "Is that him, Mom?" I nodded, unable to speak just yet, my eyes fixed on Gabriel, who hadn't moved. Tyler, standing beside us, asked in a low voice, "Think he'll run?" "No," I replied calmly, more confident than I felt. "A man like him doesn't run. He'll try to face it. He needs answers, just like anyone else in this room." Gabriel began walking toward us, his eyes never leaving mine. He struggled to maintain his composure, but I could see the tremble in his hand, clutching a wine glass. It was only something I would notice. He stopped when he was just a few steps away, taking a long, deep breath. His gaze swept over the kids beside me, as if he were trying to convince himself that what he was seeing couldn't be real. Finally, he spoke, his voice raw, almost unrecognizable. "Samantha?" I looked at him without warmth, without coldness, just the calm of someone who had survived too many heartbreaks to count. "I thought you couldn't," he stuttered. I lifted my chin and met his gaze. "This is Tyler, Elena, Lucas, and Isla." Each name I spoke seemed to crack the walls of disbelief he'd built around himself for nearly 2 decades. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His eyes darted from one face to the next, unable to process what was happening. Gabriel was silent, standing frozen, the realization dawning on him like a slow, inevitable tide. I could see him struggling to find words, but I knew he would never be able to explain away what was before him. "They're yours?" He whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't answer immediately. I wanted him to face the truth, to acknowledge what he had rejected, and to confront the pain he had chosen to walk away from all those years ago. "Yes," I said finally, holding his gaze. "They're mine, and yours." Gabriel stepped back, looking from one face to the next, as if searching for some way to deny the truth, but it was undeniable. Tyler's dark hair and striking gray eyes, Elena's deep gaze and perfectly arched brows, features that spoke of both me and him. Then, Lucas with his strong jawline and Isla, her crooked half-smile, all of them pieces of the life he had abandoned without a second thought. His gaze was still fixed on them, but his voice was soft, almost pleading. "But Samantha, you said you couldn't." I cut him off before he could finish. "We used to believe that," I said, my tone steady, almost cold. Gabriel's face twisted in disbelief. His hands gripped the wine glass so tightly that his knuckles went white. He stepped back again, and I could see the cracks in his composure starting to show. "No," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself. "No, this isn't real." He shook his head, his eyes darting between the 4 young people, as though hoping for some explanation, something that would make it all make sense. But the resemblance was undeniable, and there was nothing he could say to change it. "They're yours," he said again, more forcefully this time. How is that possible?" I saw his mind racing, trying to make sense of what was right in front of him. I could almost feel the panic rising in him, but I wasn't about to make it easy. He had walked away from me once, and now it was time for him to face the consequences of that decision. They're mine and yours, I repeated, my voice unshaken. You left me thinking I could never have children, Gabriel. You chose to walk away, and I let you. But these four, they're my children and yours. For a moment, it seemed like the whole room had stopped. The music, the conversations, the bustle of the gala, it all faded into the background as Gabriel stood frozen tin, his face pale, his eyes searching for answers he would never find. Gabriel swallowed hard, as if the words in his throat were too heavy to say. His eyes were still locked on the kids, his gaze desperate for some sign that this couldn't be true. But there was no denying it. His children, all four of them, stood before him, faces painted with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse, filled with a mix of regret and confusion. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence hang in the air, letting him stew in his thoughts for a moment. He didn't deserve an immediate answer. Not yet. "You left," I said slowly, each word hitting like a hammer. "You didn't want to face the truth, Gabriel. You chose to leave, and I wasn't about to chase after you. I needed you to come back, not for the title, not because you thought you could fix it. I needed you to choose me, to choose us, because you wanted to, not because you had to." I saw Gabriel's eyes darken, his lips pressing into a thin line. He was fighting against something deep inside him. Regret, shame, guilt, maybe all of it combined. "I didn't know," he muttered, almost to himself. "I didn't know about them." Tyler stepped forward, his eyes cool, but his tone heavy with a wisdom that far exceeded his age. "Whether you knew or not doesn't matter, Gabriel. The truth doesn't need permission to exist." Gabriel turned to him, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something resembling shame in his eyes. He didn't argue, didn't deflect. He just looked at the kids, each one of them, like he was finally seeing them for the first time. "Mom," Isla whispered, her voice barely audible but steady, "will you tell him everything?" I turned to look at her, meeting her eyes. She wasn't afraid to ask the question that had been hanging in the air since we walked into that gala. I had been holding on to the truth for so long, but now it was time. Gabriel wasn't running. He was standing there, waiting for me to tell him everything. "I will," I said quietly, my voice carrying the weight of all the years we had spent without him. "But not here. Not in front of all these people." Gabriel nodded silently, his eyes still on the children, who hadn't moved a step. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could see him struggling with every second that passed. But he didn't run. Not this time. "Come on," I said firmly, stepping away from him. "Let's go. We'll talk about this later. You want the truth? You'll get it, but only if you're brave enough to hear it." Without another word, I turned and led the kids away, walking toward the elevator, leaving Gabriel standing alone in the middle of the ballroom, Stestet lost in his own thoughts. I felt his eyes on our backs, heavy with something I couldn't quite place. Regret, fear, or perhaps a little bit of both. As the elevator doors closed behind us, Ela turned to me, her voice soft but filled with a question that still lingered in the air. "Mom," she asked quietly, "will you tell him everything?" I glanced at my reflection in the mirrored wall. The woman staring back at me was no longer defined by the tears or abandonment of the past. I was a mother of four, a woman who had carried the weight of the truth for far too long. But now I was ready to tell it, my way. "Yes," I said, my voice steady, but with a hint of something new. "I'll tell him everything, but only if he's brave enough to hear it." The next morning, when the sun barely peeked through the clouds, I sat at my desk, consumed by papers and tasks as usual. But all I could think about was the meeting with Gabriel. He couldn't just forget us. I could feel his words and gaze penetrating me. He was so close, and all I could do was think about how and when to tell him the truth. The silence between us was suffocating, but I knew it had to happen. At first, I thought I needed to be careful, to keep my distance. But after his visit, I understood. His return wasn't a mistake. He couldn't have just appeared in my life without some intent to face what he had left behind. And I couldn't let myself be the woman who waited for him to choose us. I had waited long enough. Now I had to make him face the consequences of his decision. That day when he called again, I was sitting in that very room, the one where we once built our dreams. Now it felt full of emptiness. The phone call was brief, just as his voice was low and tight. "Mom, I get it now. I want to talk, not just with you, but with the kids." I didn't answer right away. My heart was heavy, knowing how he would look at my children, at those he had left behind. But there was no time to second guess. I couldn't retreat. His choice was now mine. Time had cornered us both, and I knew we needed to meet to either end it or begin something new. A few hours later, Gabriel arrived. But this time, he wasn't in a sharp tuxedo. Instead, he wore a simple gray shirt with sleeves rolled up, the tie stuffed casually in his coat pocket. His face looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept since the night we had crossed paths again. He wasn't here for comfort. He wasn't here to play games. Gabriel had come back to face the truth, no matter how painful it would be. I opened the door, not saying a word, just stepping aside to let him in. This house had been my sanctuary with the kids. Now, Gabriel was walking into a world he had left before it even existed. As he stepped into the living room, I saw how the kids immediately became alert, especially Ela, who, holding a steaming mug, stopped in her tracks. Her eyes scanned him as if she was checking whether this man belonged in their lives. Then she spoke, her voice restrained but clear. "Hi." Gabriel nodded, as if unsure of how to react. "Hello." Then, as I walked into the living room, all 4 kids were already seated on the couch, not offering him a place beside them. Gabriel remained standing, unsure of where to position himself before speaking up. "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but I can't keep living without facing this," he said. "I need to know. I need to be heard." The kids didn't speak right away. They were looking at him, curious, uncertain, and cautious. But the first words from Lucas weren't filled with anger or bitterness. They were matter of fact, cutting right to the heart of it. "You came here to feel better? You left before we were even born. Now you want everything to just magically be okay?" Gabriel swallowed hard, clearly affected by the weight of the words. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. His lips parted, but his voice failed him. Tyler, always the more reserved of the 4, took a step forward, his voice calm yet heavy with everything he had kept inside. "You didn't know, but you knew Mom. You knew the kind of person she was. Did it ever cross your mind that if she chose to be a mother, there was nothing that could stop her?" Gabriel looked at Tyler, a moment of silence passing between them. His eyes softened as if he were finally understanding the gravity of what he had left behind. "I didn't know," he muttered, a weak admission of guilt. Isla then placed her cup on the table, and her voice was soft, but unyielding. "What would you have done if you knew? If you knew there was a chance to have kids with Mom, would you have stayed?" Her question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Everyone waited for Gabriel's response, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything. He walked toward the window, his back to the room, and took a deep breath before turning around to face us again. "I want to say yes," he replied, his voice shaking. "I want to say I would have stayed, that I would have fought for it. But if I'm being honest, who I was back then, I don't know. I was scared of a life I hadn't chosen, and the truth is, I chose to leave." Isla leaned forward, eyes never leaving him. "So what do you choose now?" Gabriel looked at each of them slowly, as if he were committing their faces to memory. His voice was steadier now, full of sincerity. "Now I choose not to run. I choose to take responsibility. Even if I'm never forgiven, I won't disappear again." Tyler stood up, walking toward him. There they were, 2 men, one young and one older, facing each other. Tyler's words were direct, unflinching. "Your presence won't change the past, but you can decide what to do with the present." I watched as my children stood before Gabriel. None of them pushed him away, but they didn't embrace him either. They asked their questions, still guarded, but they weren't rejecting him outright. I stepped forward, my voice firm but calm. "If you came here hoping for a warm welcome, I can't promise you that. But if you came to take responsibility, this door won't be locked." Gabriel nodded slowly. For the first time in years, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't about ambition or control. It was about trying, even if it was just a little bit. Lucas shrugged, not dismissing him, but not fully embracing him either. We don't need a dad, but sometimes it's not the worst thing to have someone willing to listen. Gabriel gave a small smile, a rare one. It wasn't wide, but it was sincere. He looked at me, eyes searching. "Thank you," he whispered. Gabriel started showing up regularly, but he never pushed himself into our lives. He was careful, considerate, always respectful of the kids' routines. He would send short, simple messages. If you're free, I'm at the bookstore near campus. Found some interesting titles. Or, I discovered a sandwich place near the dorms, saving it for next time if you're curious. At first, the kids didn't respond, but little by little, each one began to reply in their own way. Tyler was the first to take the bait, the most reserved of them all. One day, after class, he showed up at the cafe where Gabriel was waiting. No announcements, no handshakes, just a simple gesture. He pulled up a chair and said, "I've got 30 minutes. If you want to ask something, do it." Gabriel didn't ask him anything. Instead, he told an absurd story about how he had once lost his wallet in college and had to photocopy IDs just to survive. It was so ridiculous, so out of place, that Tyler couldn't help but laugh. It was the first time I had seen him genuinely smile since Gabriel reappeared in our lives. Elena was different. She kept her distance at first, always hovering near the door, as though she might leave at any moment. But when Gabriel casually mentioned a local art exhibit, her passion shining through in her eyes, her demeanor changed. By their second meeting, she brought her sketchbook. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Not once did she say the word father, but they connected in a way that felt natural, not forced. Lucas, ever the skeptic, was the hardest to crack. He challenged Gabriel with questions that cut straight to the point. "Why now?" he asked. "What if we don't let you in?" Gabriel didn't have the perfect answers, but he didn't try to evade them either. He looked Lucas in the eye and said, "I don't have the right answers, but I'm not disappearing again." Slowly, Lucas stopped flinching every time Gabriel came around. There was no instant forgiveness, but there was a slow, gradual acceptance. Isla was the last to open up, but once she did, she changed the quickest. One rainy afternoon, she texted Gabriel, "Bus stuck? You free?" Within 12 minutes, Gabriel showed up with a raincoat and a small umbrella, ready to help without hesitation. She didn't say much on the ride, but when she got out, she left a note in the glove compartment. "Thanks for coming." I watched everything from a distance, quietly observing how things were unfolding. I didn't interfere. I didn't guide them. I simply stood at the edge, watching my children cross bridges they had once feared. One late evening, after all 4 kids had returned home, I saw them gathered around the kitchen table, laughing and talking. Tyler was recounting his visit to the art exhibit with Gabriel and Elena. Lucas teasing Isla for calling him this year's most weathered man, and Elena just smiled, watching them all with a quiet sense of contentment. I didn't join in the conversation. I stood at the doorway, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, feeling something shifting between these people who had once been strangers to Gabriel. It wasn't anything big, nothing that screamed change, but it was something subtle, something real. As I watched them, a text came in from Gabriel. "Thank you for not closing every door." I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling a wave of emotion I wasn't quite ready to confront. But I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I wasn't ready to say thank you just yet. Deep inside, one question still hadn't been answered, the real reason he left all those years ago. Was it really just because I couldn't have children? Or was there something else? Something he still hadn't found the courage to say? One early autumn evening, as the chill of the season began to settle in, Isla walked into the kitchen with a question that stopped me in my tracks. It was soft, almost like a sigh, but coming from Isla, the youngest and most sensitive of all the kids, it carried a weight no one had dared to touch until now. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel, who had been slicing apples, froze. The knife tapped softly against the cutting board, then fell silent. He looked up, meeting Isla's eyes. They were clear and piercing, just like mine, but with the same intensity Gabriel used to have. The room went still. The other kids all turned toward him, waiting for an answer that had been hanging in the air for years. Gabriel set the knife down slowly, wiped his hands on a dish towel, and pulled out a chair across from Isla. He didn't deflect. He didn't sigh. He just sat there, in silence, for what seemed like an eternity, before finally speaking, his voice low and hoarse. "Yes," he said, his voice raw. "Every single day." Isla tilted her head, eyes searching his face, waiting for more. "What do you regret?" Gabriel looked at each face around the table, as if seeing these children for the first time. Memories he had never been part of suddenly became so vivid they felt painful. "I regret not being brave enough to stay," he said quietly. "I regret letting fear overpower love. I regret walking away instead of fighting. And most of all, I regret missing every single one of your firsts." There was no interruption. No one spoke. We all let him finish, the weight of his words settling in the room like a cloud that refused to dissipate. When he was done, Gabriel looked up at the kids, his eyes steady but full of remorse. "I once thought I needed a perfect family," he continued, his voice steadier now, "the kind everyone expects. But in the end, what I truly needed were the people sitting right here." The room was quiet, not heavy with judgment, but contemplative. Lucas still had his arms crossed, but his eyes had softened. Elena rested her chin on her hand, watching Gabriel, no longer with skepticism, but with something closer to understanding. Tyler gave the smallest nod, barely noticeable, but it was a sign nonetheless. And Isla kept her gaze steady, unwavering. "So what do you want now?" she asked, her voice firm, yet gentle. Gabriel's eyes were filled with longing, but he didn't look desperate. He looked like a man who had finally understood what he had lost. "Just one thing," he said, his voice quieter than before. "The chance to not miss anything else." The silence stretched on for a moment, not heavy, but thoughtful. No one spoke for a while, as if we were all weighing his words against the future. Gabriel wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't even asking for a second chance. He was just asking for the opportunity to be present, to be a part of their lives, however imperfect that might be. That night, after the kids went upstairs, I found myself standing in the kitchen, sipping a cup of tea, feeling the weight of everything that had been said. Gabriel had left, and I couldn't shake the feeling that things were starting to shift, but I wasn't sure whether it was for the better. He wasn't pushing us, and that was something. He was taking things slowly, maybe too slowly, but at least he was trying. I glanced out of the window. The sky had darkened, and the first few stars were starting to twinkle. It felt like everything outside was still, but inside there was a quiet hum of change. Over the next few days, Gabriel continued to make his presence known, though never in a way that demanded attention. He'd leave small, unobtrusive messages. "Found a new cafe near your campus. Thought you might like it." Or, "Hey, there's an art exhibit downtown. I think you'd enjoy it." He wasn't pushing himself into their lives. It was clear that he understood that this was something that couldn't be rushed. And while the kids didn't always respond, I noticed little shifts. Tyler started replying here and there. Elena asked him about an exhibit she'd been wanting to see. And Lucas was still a challenge, but he no longer froze when Gabriel appeared on the porch. Isla was the first to fully let her guard down. One evening, I saw her sitting on the porch swing with Gabriel, the two of them talking quietly, her head tilted as she listened to him. It wasn't a conversation about the past or the future. It was just a conversation. And that in itself felt like progress. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all standing on the edge of something. I wasn't sure what Gabriel wanted, what he expected, but he wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. His attempts at redemption, however small, felt real. He wasn't asking us to forget the past, but he was asking for a place in our present. Then, one evening, as the fall chills started to creep in, there was a knock at the door. It was just after dinner and the kids were gathered in the living room. I opened the door, expecting to find a package or maybe one of the neighbors asking about something trivial. But instead, there stood Gabriel, holding a small box of waffle cookies and a file folder in his hands. He looked tired, worn out, but his eyes were soft, no longer the sharp, calculating look I remembered. This was the face of a man who had let go of his pride, a man who wasn't afraid to show vulnerability. I brought these for you," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Waffle cookies from that bakery you used to love, the one that closed down." I stared at him for a moment, not knowing what to say. It was such a simple gesture, and yet it felt like a bridge had been built between us, even if it was just a small one. "You remembered?" I asked, my voice soft. Gabriel nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I remember a lot of things." I stepped aside, letting him in. I didn't invite him in for any grand gesture. I didn't need to. I just didn't want to stand in his way anymore. The past had been messy, painful, but it didn't have to define what could come next. We sat down in the living room, the box of cookies resting between us, and the kids, surprisingly, didn't shy away. They didn't rush to fill the silence with questions. It wasn't a perfect reunion. It wasn't even a reunion at all. But it was a moment, a small piece of what could be. "Do you want to know why I brought these?" Gabriel asked, his voice steady now, as if he was ready to finally explain the weight he'd been carrying all this time. I looked at him, watching as he took a deep breath. The kids were watching too, each one sitting on the couch, their eyes darting between us. "Because," he began slowly, "I wanted to bring something that wasn't complicated. Something simple. I've spent so much time trying to fix things that I forgot to just be present. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for everything I've missed, but I know I can start by showing up." Tyler, sitting beside me, gave a small nod. It was subtle, but it was there. It felt like a small shift, a change in the way he viewed Gabriel. And then, without saying anything more, he reached for one of the cookies and took a bite. Elena followed, then Lucas, and finally Isla. They didn't say anything about the past. They didn't make any dramatic statements. They just ate the cookies, and it felt, in that moment, like enough. For the first time, Gabriel didn't seem like a stranger standing in front of us. He wasn't the man who had walked away. He wasn't the man who couldn't face the truth. He was just Gabriel, someone who had made mistakes, who had hurt people, but who was willing to show up, even if it was only in small ways. As the evening wore on, we all quietly went about our own business. The kids started talking amongst themselves, sharing their plans for the weekend. I was still sitting on the couch, my mind racing with everything that had happened, everything that could still happen. Gabriel stayed for a while longer, but he didn't overstay. He didn't force anything. He just sat there listening, and when he left, it was without fanfare. That night, as I sat in the quiet of the house, I thought about everything that had changed in such a short amount of time. Gabriel hadn't fixed everything, and maybe he never would. But for the first time in years, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't holding on to the pain of what had happened. I was just letting it go. And I wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but I knew one thing: the door was open, and for the first time, I wasn't standing in its way. The days that followed were quiet, but small changes were happening. Gabriel began visiting more regularly, but never in a way that overwhelmed us. He would send simple messages like, "Found a new cafe near your campus. Thought you might like it." Or, "There's an art exhibit downtown. I think you'd enjoy it." At first, the kids didn't respond, but little by little, each one began to reply in their own way. Tyler was the first to engage. One day, after class, he showed up at the cafe where Gabriel was waiting. No big conversation, just Tyler sitting down and saying, "I've got 30 minutes. Ask whatever you need." Gabriel told a ridiculous story about losing his wallet in college. Tyler laughed, and for the first time, I saw them connect. Elena kept her distance at first, but after Gabriel mentioned an art exhibit, she brought her sketchbook, and they talked for hours. Lucas was the hardest, but even he stopped avoiding Gabriel. Ela, the youngest, was the first to completely let her guard down, texting Gabriel for help one rainy afternoon and leaving him a note afterward. "Thanks for coming." One evening, Gabriel knocked on the door. He wasn't carrying anything extravagant, just a small box of waffle cookies and a file folder. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a bridge was being built. I invited him in, and we sat down. He didn't speak much, just shared that he wanted to be present, to show up for the kids, to try even if he couldn't undo the past. Later, Gabriel and I went to the cafe by the lake, the place we used to visit. The drive there was quiet, but when we arrived, the atmosphere felt strangely familiar. "How have you been?" Gabriel asked, breaking the silence. "I've been good, busy," I replied, but the truth was I had no idea where I was emotionally. "I know I've made a mess of things," Gabriel said softly, "but I want to try. I'm not asking for anything, just a chance." I hesitated, then replied, "It's not just about us, Gabriel. It's about what you left behind." Gabriel nodded. "I'm not running anymore. I just want to be a part of their lives, if they'll let me." I looked at him, seeing the man who left all those years ago now trying to make amends. "I don't know if they're ready," I said, "and I don't know if I am either. But you've hurt them." "I don't expect you to forget," Gabriel said quietly, But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. We sat in silence for a while, then left without any promises made, both lost in our own thoughts. When I returned home, I found the kids already upstairs. The house felt different. Not in a bad way, just different. I didn't know what was coming next, but I knew Gabriel wasn't going anywhere, and neither was I. The following weeks were quiet, but I could feel the tension shifting. Gabriel didn't push. He never forced himself into our lives, but he was there, always there, in subtle ways. He would leave short messages, always giving space, never demanding anything in return. Slowly, the kids started accepting him back, piece by piece. Tyler, still reserved, would occasionally respond to his messages. Elena started asking about exhibits. Lucas gave him a nod when they crossed paths. And Isla was still the first to give him a chance. But nothing about it felt rushed. Gabriel didn't act like he deserved forgiveness. He just wanted to be there, to show up. And the kids weren't sure whether they should let him in or not. They didn't make it easy for him, but they didn't shut him out either. It was progress, but slow, tentative. One night, when Gabriel showed up with another round of cookies, the kids were watching a movie in the living room. Tyler, always the first to stay behind, offered him a seat without saying much. It wasn't much of a welcome, but it was something. A small gesture. Gabriel sat down, not saying anything about the past. Instead, he talked about a new book he'd been reading, and slowly, the conversation shifted from awkward silence to casual chatter. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it felt like a real step forward. As the weeks passed, I noticed more of these moments. Gabriel helping Hila with her school project, Elena asking for his opinion on a piece of art she was working on. Even Lucas, who had been the most guarded, starting to ask Gabriel for advice on his latest college application. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And yet, I still couldn't shake the feeling of waiting for the other shoe to drop. I had let Gabriel back into our lives, but I wasn't sure how long this fragile peace would last. Was he really going to stay, or would he just leave again once everything got too real? One evening after dinner, I sat with him outside on the porch, both of us staring at the stars in silence. The kids had gone upstairs to their rooms, and for the first time in a while, there was just quiet between us. "I'm trying, Sam," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "I don't want to mess this up again." I turned to look at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. It was the first time he'd really acknowledged how much he had to lose, how much he had already lost. "You've already messed up," I replied, my voice steady but not unkind. "But you're here now. That's all that matters right now, being here." Gabriel nodded slowly, his gaze falling to the ground, lost in his thoughts. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to fix everything. I don't know if I can make up for the years I missed." "You can't," I said gently, "but that doesn't mean you can't try. The kids deserve that, and so do you." He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for letting me try." I watched him for a moment, the man who had once walked away, now trying so hard to be part of our lives. But I wasn't sure if he understood what it truly meant to rebuild trust, to reconnect after so many years. It wasn't just about showing up. It was about consistency. It was about proving he wasn't going anywhere, not just physically, but emotionally. The next day, Gabriel came by to take the kids out for ice cream. It was a simple plan, but one that felt like a huge step for him. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was just trying to be part of their world. They hesitated at first, but eventually, they all agreed. I watched them leave, all four of them piling into Gabriel's car, and I stood there, feeling a strange mix of emotions. I wasn't sure what would come next. Was this the beginning of something? Or was it just a brief moment in time, a fleeting chance for Gabriel to make up for his past mistakes? I didn't know. But what I did know was that they weren't pushing him away anymore. They were letting him in, slowly but surely. As I closed the door behind me and sat back down, I realized I wasn't holding my breath anymore. I wasn't waiting for the inevitable disappointment. I had let go of that expectation. Gabriel was here, and I was here. That was enough for now. Time passed, and though it was slow, the changes were undeniable. Gabriel had earned a place in our lives, not through grand gestures, but through consistency. He didn't try to make up for the past in a day, but he showed up when it mattered, little by little. For the first time in years, I wasn't the only one holding everything together. He was, in his own way, starting to help carry the weight of the life I had built with the kids. Tyler, Alina, Lucas, and Isla, each one of them had found their own way to welcome him back. Tyler still kept his distance, but his small nods and conversations with Gabriel were a sign of acceptance, even if unspoken. Alina, always open to new connections, had found common ground with him through their shared interest in art. Lucas, ever cautious, had come to rely on Gabriel's advice about school and life, though he never called him Dad. And Ela, the one who had always been the most sensitive, now looked at him not with suspicion, but with understanding. She wasn't holding on to the past anymore, not in the same way she once had. And me? I had finally let go of the anger. The hurt was still there, buried deep, but it no longer defined my every moment. Gabriel hadn't fixed everything, and maybe he never would, but he was trying, and that was enough. One evening, about 6 months after that night, we went to the cafe by the lake. Gabriel and I sat together on the porch. The kids were upstairs, busy with their own lives, and we finally had a moment to ourselves. The soft hum of the evening, the sound of crickets in the distance, filled the silence between us. "I know this isn't perfect," Gabriel said, his voice quiet but steady. "And I know I can't make up for all the time I lost. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." I turned to him, my heart a little lighter than it had been in years. The man sitting beside me wasn't the one who had left. He wasn't the man who couldn't face the truth. He was here, willing to try, willing to be present, and that was all I could ask for. "You don't have to make up for everything," I said, my voice soft. "You just have to keep showing up. That's what matters." Gabriel smiled, a smile that was softer now, more real than any smile I'd seen from him in the past. It wasn't the smile of a man trying to impress or redeem himself. It was just the smile of a man who had learned, in the hardest way possible, what really mattered. "I can do that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not perfect, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." And just like that, the weight that had hung over us for so long seemed to lift. There were no promises for the future, no grand declarations of forgiveness, but there didn't need to be. We were both here, in this moment, and that was enough. The kids came downstairs later, laughing and talking about their day. They weren't perfect either. They had their flaws, their struggles, their fears. But they were learning, growing, and they were starting to see that even in broken things, there could still be room for healing. Gabriel had become part of their world, and maybe, just maybe, I could begin to accept that there was a place for him in mine too. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Gabriel was already up, making breakfast for the kids. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough to remind me that he was here and he wasn't leaving. For the first time in a long time, I felt like everything was okay. Not perfect, not fixed, but okay. The past had shaped us all, but it didn't have to define us anymore. We weren't living in the shadow of what had been. We were living in the quiet moments of what was, of a life rebuilt, step by step, day by day. And maybe that was all we could ask for.